Okay, well, welcome everybody to the Hilary term Philosophy of Physics seminars. And it's a great pleasure to have the series this term kicked off by Tushar Menon. As many of you know, Tushar was an MST student in Philosophy of Physics back in 2013, I think, yeah. And then did, so the golden era. And then did the DPhil here, and is now a postdoc, a British Academy postdoc at Cambridge, but luckily for us, often and normally around in Oxford. And he's been a mainstay of the Oxford Philosophy of Physics community for many, many years. Published widely in Philosophy of Physics on supersymmetry, non-commutative geometry, the dynamical approach. And today he's speaking on dynamical substantivalism. Tushar.
Well, Ollie, thank you so much for the really kind introduction and for the invitation. Sorry to upset the rhythm, but I can't seem to get rid of this. There we go. Now I've got it. Now as well. All right, great. Okay. Sorry, where was I? Yes, thank you all for coming. I'm feeling mildly euphoric just to see all of you in person and many of you online. I know a couple of people, certainly a couple of people online today have informed me that they can't stay till the end. So I'm just going to spoil the talk. I'm just going to tell you what the punchline is. Get it over and done with in the first 3 or 4 minutes, and then hopefully we can enjoy the filler together as we proceed. So here's what I take. I take this talk to be making 2 points, and it would be nice if people thought, oh, well, that's obviously true. But I'm perfectly happy to have people sort of come along with me for the ride and sort of get off at various stations along the way. The first sort of station is this claim that the dynamical versus geometrical approach, which many of us in this room and online are familiar with, and if you're not, don't worry, I'll get to it, should be treated as orthogonal to this sort of traditional debate in the philosophy of physics that goes under the name of substantivalism versus relationalism. And that on its own is not a super interesting claim. It's certainly not an original claim. Lots of people in this room have made this claim. Harvey says this in his book. James recently wrote a paper in which he makes it, in which he explicitly says this. But there are other people who deny this orthogonality. And I think more than arguing for this orthogonality thesis, I'd like to think that what would be useful in this talk is something like a diagnosis of why some people think we should treat them as sort of coextensive, and why some other people might think that they ought to be orthogonal, right? So that's the first take-home message. There's going to be a diagnosis of why these two debates are orthogonal. And then following the diagnosis, I'm going to say, well, assuming that we are correct to diagnose these as orthogonal, which I argue we are, there's one particular option that becomes available to us that was previously unavailable, certainly to people who deny the orthogonality thesis, and that's the position of what I call dynamical substantivalism, shockingly. And if you'll indulge me in a little bit of a metaphor, I think the way that I want to argue for dynamical substantivalism is not, well, this view is obviously true. I want to think of the philosopher, or in this case, the metaphysician, as somewhat akin to a waiter in a restaurant. You go into a restaurant and you say, well, these are the things that I like, and these are the things that I don't like. Do you have anything that sort of satisfies these criteria? And if you're a good waiter, you say, well, can't give you everything that you want, but if you're willing to drop, your dislike of garlic, then I can suggest to you such and such a view, or such and such a dish, or a view if he's a metaphysical waiter. But what I want to do is something similar. I want to say, look, there are certain antecedent metaphysical commitments that you might have, maybe with respect to modality, or maybe with respect to laws of nature, or something like that. And I want to make I want to argue that dynamical substantivalism sits very, very comfortably with a particular combination of these views in a way that if you were to treat these two debates as coextensive, you would not be in a position to satisfy. So basically, a bunch of antecedent commitments that you might have, dynamical substantivalism should look attractive to you on the basis of some commitments that you might have. And I'll flesh it out in more detail as the talk goes on. All right. So that's if you need to leave now, I won't take it the wrong way. That's really all I'm going to be saying in this talk. But now let's try to flesh this out a little bit more. So I want to start by talking about substantivalism and relationalism, which I take, among other things, to be asking a question like this. The debate is over whether or not there are immaterial space-time points in the possible worlds, in the physically possible worlds, according to some theory, right? So these positions are going to be indexed to particular theories. In this talk, as it happens, I'm just going to keep things really simple and imagine we're only discussing this in the context of Newtonian mechanics, maybe special relativity, because really what I want to get across is something a bit more conceptually basic, that I don't want to be sort of upset by further complications. So the question is, are there any immaterial space-time points? And by immaterial, I mean something like this intuitive picture of an unoccupied space-time point, right? The kind of thing about which a substantivalist wants to be a realist about. And obviously, as I've sort of slightly given away, substantivalism, the position of substantivalism asserts that there are immaterial space-time points, and the position of relationalism denies that, right? Perfectly straightforward. But the way that I've set up this question, it's a question about ontology. And we all live in post-1948 Anglophone philosophy worlds. So the first person we call up and ask is Quine. And we ask Quine the question of how we ought to spell out our ontological commitments. And Quine says, well, to be is to be quantified over, right? It's to be the value of a bound variable. And you say, okay, well, how am I supposed to make sense of quantification? It turns out that our standard way of making sense of quantification is via model theory. And you go, okay, well, how am I supposed to make sense of quantification in our favorite physical theories? Well, hooray, our standard theory of physical theories or scientific theories is also model theory. So we've got a very, very straightforward prescription for how to talk about our ontological commitments, right? Give me general relativity or give me Newtonian mechanics. What you've given me is a collection of models. And all I need to do is look into those models, look at the domain of discourse, see what's being quantified over, and that's the game, right? So the ontological question, as understood in this Quinean way, can be reformulated as follows. Do our theories models quantify over immaterial space-time points, right? Substantivalism says yes, relationalism says no. But it's been almost exactly 75 years since Quine suggested this. And there have been, in the years since then, other suggestions for how we ought to spell out our ontological commitments. And so I want to address another proposal. And this is it's a bit more nebulous. I think different people have proposed things in this general vicinity in a number of different ways. And what I'm going to discuss is what we'll call abductive realism. And the way that I'm going to cash it out is by following a suggestion from a paper by Boyd in the early 70s. Although people like David Armstrong have also suggested things sort of suggestively similar. And basically what Boyd is arguing for, sort of one of the arch scientific realists, what he's arguing for is the scientific realist position according to which the evidence that we have for the goodness or the truth or whatever virtue you want of your favorite theory should be treated as experimental evidence for the causal relations that best explain the observed regularities, right? This is a pretty standard inference to the best explanation type argument for scientific realism. And the idea is things that stand in particular causal relations to our observed regularities are the sorts of things to which one might want to be ontologically committed. Now, I want to expand things to go beyond merely causal explanations. So I'm going to generalize this a little bit and just say, here's a position of abductive realism. X exists according to some theory. If X is explanatorily, and this is a bit of a hedge, but explanatorily valuable or perhaps indispensable according to that theory, right? So now we've got a different take on the ontological question, a different way of spelling it out, right? And this is the abductive take. Are immaterial space-time points explanatorily valuable or indispensable, however you might want to put it, in explaining, insert your favorite thing from your favorite theory here, right? Particle trajectories or behaviors or certain dynamical facts. Once again, the substantivalist, among other things that they might say, will say yes to this, and the relationalist will say no to this, one hopes. But if you now look at this abductive take on the ontological question a bit carefully, and consider a special case where the thing that you're trying to explain is facts about dynamical symmetries in our favorite theories, we might ask the question, are immaterial space-time points explanatorily valuable in explaining those? And if you spend any time at all in this room, you'll start to realize that that debate looks familiar. Because that debate is very much associated with this kind of question. Does space-time structure explain dynamical symmetry structure, or vice versa? And this is the dynamical versus geometrical debate that had its sort of I think it's most convincing and sharpest articulation in work that Harvey and Oliver did in the early 2000s. And it's been a mainstay of Oxford philosophy physics for a while. So don't blame me. I just work here. So now the two positions with respect to this question are as follows. Just follow the direction of the arrow. The geometrical approach says space-time structure explains dynamical symmetries, and I'll come later on to how we might want to cash out this explains claim. But now I just want to get these things on the table. The dynamical approach says no, the arrow of explanation goes the other way. But now, when looked at through the lens of this abductive take on the ontological question, it looks like the geometrical approach is just a subset of substantivalism. And the dynamical approach is just a subset of relationalism, which is why some people, I think completely sensibly, just take it to be sufficient to say, well, I'm a substantivalist or I'm a relationalist, or I'm a proponent of the geometric approach. And then the other position sort of automatically follows from that, right? It's like saying, well, I don't have to say that this coat is both gray and I should have come up with a better example of this because I can't think of any word to describe this other than gray. Well, my shirt is both lilac and purple. There you go. There's an example of the kind of redundancy that I imagine people who are sympathetic to a kind of abductive realist view would think about people who might want to claim that you have to specify whether you're both a relationalist and a dynamicist or a substantivalist and a geometrician. And so that's sort of my take on on the diagnosis of why some people might want to deny this orthogonality thesis. And if you look at the sort of standard presentation of the positions of substantivalism and relationalism in the literature, you'll see that everyone is sort of tacitly committed to there being an explanatory claim in there. But what people don't do is sort of separate that from the ontological commitment claim, right? And as things stand, that's perhaps not all that surprising. I mean, I've set up Quinean realism and I've set up abductive realism, but they're obviously not entirely disjoint, right? The Quinean realist might perfectly reasonably say, well, the thing over which I ought to quantify is the set of things that are explanatorily indispensable, right? So even the Quinean realist can countenance a view on which explanation plays a non-trivial role in teasing out ontological commitments. Right? And I think that's the kind of thing that people have in the back of their minds when they say stuff like I'm about to put up. So I'm only going to talk about substantivalism in the interest of time, but similar claims are made about how to make sense of relationalism, right? So this is from the metaphysics literature. This is Shamik Dasgupta. And Shamik says, the issue here in this debate is whether geometric relations between material bodies are, the scare quotes are all his, determined or fixed or accounted for, I might add, or explained by their positions in substantival space as the substantivalist thinks, right? So you can clearly see there's a sort of quantificational aspect, right? The stuff about substantival space, but there's also this explanatory aspect, right? And it's explicitly there. Similarly, from the philosophy of physics literature, from the sort of classic philosophy of physics literature, this is Gordon Bellot in the late 90s, where he says the substantivalist thinks of a physical geometry as being comprised of points standing in relation to one another, and of the spatio-temporal relations between material objects and events as deriving from, right? That's where I take the explanatory claim to come from, deriving from the relations between the points they occupy, right? So as I've set things up, it seems like there's a good reason to not want to abide by the orthogonality thesis, right? To remind you, it's just the thesis that these two debates are orthogonal. And there are people who've explicitly argued this. Oliver, for example, in his review article on substantivalism and relationalism says, if I remember correctly, in section 6.3.2, I have read this paper many times, the dynamical approach seeks to offer a reductive account of the Minkowskian spacetime interval in terms of the dynamical symmetry of laws governing matter. It therefore qualifies as a type of relationalism, right? Explicit. Pablo Acuna, in a lovely paper from Studies a few years ago, also says something quite similar. He says, Janssen's view, so Michel Janssen's view, in many ways, Michel Janssen is the arch anti-dynamical approach person. And what Pablo says is Janssen's view is connected to a form of substantivalism, whereas Brown's view assumes a form of relationalism, right? And my diagnosis of why these people very sensibly say these things is because there's, if not abductive realism, something in that vicinity that underlies these sorts of claims. But there are people who've argued in favor of the orthogonality thesis, right? As I mentioned right at the beginning, Harvey, for example, says his book is not intended to be a defense of relationalism, notwithstanding various sympathies that he might have for that position. And Michel Janssen, in the paper that Pablo is responding to, says, given that my argument is ultimately not about ontology, it had better be independent of substantivalism versus relationalism. And I think this is quite an instructive thing that Michel says in this paper, because he's saying explicitly, this argument is not about ontology, it's about something like whatever else it is, explanation or whatever. And so what that means is he's sort of explicitly, well, I guess maybe not explicitly, tacitly disavowing this abductive realist view of ontological commitments. Much more recently, last year, James, or maybe the year before, James had a paper in which he argued that these two things should be decoupled, right? And so my claim is that the decoupling of these two debates requires that we deny abductive realism, right? The diagnosis is that abductive realism leads to their coupling, and if you want to decouple them, you just modus tollens. So what else do we have at our disposal in order to decouple these two debates? Well, we might go Quinean, but of course we need to be a little bit careful because, as I just mentioned, in general, it's not obvious that that Quinean realism is incompatible with quantifying over explanatorily indispensable entities, right? So if we've got, so supposing this is Quinean, I can't write Q's anymore. This is Quinean and this is abductive. There's a bit in there. There's a sort of non-trivial overlap in there. I'm interested in understanding what's going on in the bit of Quinean realism that doesn't countenance this explanatory story with respect to ontological commitments. And so let's call that austere realism, right? So austere realism just sits in this bit of the diagram. What I want to say, what I want to explore is the idea that we can talk about ontological commitment in this purely austere quantificational way without making any, without there being any work to do for explanation, at least when it comes to the ontological commitments. Now, you might be a little bit ahead of me and realize that there's immediately a problem with this, right? Because given the standard characterizations of substantivalism that I described a couple of slides ago, invoke some kind of explanatory component, it seems as if austere realism on its own can't capture the standard characterizations of substantivalism, right? To quote our dear friend Niels Martens, it's like we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. He wasn't the first person to say it, but I think he's the person who said it the most often, certainly in my presence. So what do we do, right? Well, let's go back to Quine. It's a shame Simon's not here in person, but thanks for joining us online, Simon. So let's invoke another bit of useful machinery from Quine, this distinction that he has between ontology and ideology. And sort of very roughly speaking, I'm happy to flesh this out in more detail if necessary, but sort of very roughly speaking, the idea is ontology is just the stuff there is. It's just a description of all the stuff that our theory is kind of is committed to when it comes to the question of what we quantify over. And ideology refers to the sort of the primitive relations and properties associated with the ontology according to our best theory, right? So a way of thinking about this is the ontology covers the stuff in the domain of discourse and the ideology covers the primitive relations that they stand in, all the properties that you might ascribe to them, right? So now we've seen that the standard conceptions of substantivalism have an explanatory component, but in the standard conception, it sort of seems like the explanatory component is hitting claims of ontology. What I want to suggest is we can perfectly legitimately talk about explanatory components, but only if we allow them to talk about ideology rather than ontology, right? And here's an example, I think, that makes this maybe hopefully a little plausible, right? When we talk about something like, well, what's the explanation for why two electrons repel? The explanation doesn't come at the level of ontology, right? The explanation is not because they are electrons, unless it's a really rubbish explanation. The better explanation is something like because they are both negative, they both have the same charge, and according to our best laws of physics, blah, 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 blah. And once you invoke charge, you're invoking a property, and that's part of the ideology, right? So at least prima facie, it seems plausible to suggest that the explanatory component in all of this talk of substantivalism should hit ideology and not ontology. And so this leads to my suggestion, which is we can still look to austere realism for the purely ontological commitment, right? For the commitment of, are there immaterial space-time points? But then if we want to talk about explanation of things like dynamical symmetries or trajectories or whatever, well, we need to look elsewhere for those metaphysical commitments. In particular, I suggest we look at a plausible account of explanation, right? And so here's a sort of a neologism for you. I'm going to call this luxury realism, right? It's going to take the ontological commitments from austere realism, and it's going to take the further kind of ideological commitments from hopefully a plausible story of explanation. So that's pretty much the first part of the talk. This gets on the table most of what I'm now going to play with in the next half of the talk. So let me briefly summarize. I mentioned two approaches to the ontological question, the Quinean approach and the abductive approach, and also mentioned that they're not sort of prima facie disjoint. My diagnosis of why some people think that the debates are orthogonal and some others do not is down to whether or not they accept something in the vicinity of abductive realism. And the claim that I want to argue for in the rest of this talk is that the orthogonality thesis is true. And so it's a straight up modus tollens, we should drop abductive realism. But if we drop abductive realism, we can't go straight for nothing but austere realism, because then we lose the resources to describe the positions that we want to talk about. And so what we need to do is we need to add something to austere realism, and that's the thing that we add is an explanatory claim, which I'll say more about in the next part of the talk. And you put those two things together, and you've got the two pillars of what I call luxury realism. And then towards the end of the talk, I'm going to give you an example of a concrete position that's made available by acceptance of luxury realism. Right? I'm going to talk about dynamical substantivalism because I think that's more plausible than geometrical relationalism. So the plan for this talk, sorry, this was a slightly long cold open, which is basically the first half of the talk. So yeah, I'm done with part one. I'm done with the introduction and setup. The next part is now going to talk about the two pillars of luxury realism. I'm going to try to make them try to put them in good philosophical standing, because there are a couple of problems, certainly with austere realism, that immediately suggest themselves. And so if luxury realism is to get off the ground, it has to be on the basis of the pillars on which it stands being relatively robust. And that's what I'm going to try to argue for in the next two subsections. So now just to return to the take-home messages, right, to demonstrate now that I've got stuff on the table, what I want to argue, orthogonality thesis, right? And then if we accept luxury realism, this renders available a wider range of plausible metaphysical cocktails. Well, I guess I'm mixing metaphors. So the metaphysician as a waiter and a bartender, as the metaphysical bartender. And once I've done that, I want to then finally, in the last few minutes, argue that dynamical substantivalism is an attractive view, given certain antecedent commitments that are not completely insane. Good. I'm happy to pause for just a second if there are any questions at this point about the setup, because now it's just going to sort of hopefully smoothly run to the finish. No? Fantastic. Okay. So let's talk about the austere realism component first. So the claim that I want to make is that austere realism answers the ontological question, certainly with respect to space-time substantivalism, but also just more generally when it comes to trying to tease out ontological commitments for scientific realists. But it does so in a slightly less than obvious kind of way, right? It's not quite the manner in which one might expect a story to tease out ontological commitments. And the reason it's not quite what one might expect is down to a problem that's known as Putnam's paradox in David Lewis's parlance. It's specifically one of Putnam's permutation arguments. And so the goal of this section is to demonstrate that a sort of naive austere realism is subject to worries from Putnam's paradox, but nonetheless there is a fix, and once we establish that fix, we're off to the races. So, as it happens, Putnam's permutation argument is incredibly easy to express using pictures. And so this is a picture that I purloined from Tim Button's book on Putnam. And the basic idea is something like the following. I've been handed some theory, so I've been handed some models. Let's imagine a really, really simple theory that just has maybe 2 or 3 sort of interesting sentences, right? Sentences like Ajax is a cat, Betty is a cat, and Chad is not a cat, right? The model for that theory, or one of the models for that theory, will have all of these things that's on the left-hand side of this diagram, which are components of the domain of discourse. And then we just add labels to each of them, right? We have Ajax and Betty and Chad. And then we've got a single predicate, which is a one-place predicate, is a cat. And it turns out that the things that satisfy that predicate are, according to this particular model, those 2 sort of catty-looking things. The problem is, when it comes to model theoretic truth, it's actually incredibly easy to set up model theoretic truth, because truth is preserved under isomorphisms of models in a way that reference is not. And what I mean by that is, supposing we take the same domain of discourse and then just shuffle things around, changing the relationship between the labels and the stuff in the domain of discourse, but not changing the relationship between the labels and the things that name the predicate, well then we end up with a distinct but isomorphic model in which sentences like Betty is a cat continue to come out to be true. And sentences like Ajax is a cat continue to come out to be true. But now we've got the problem where the referential claims across these two models are distinct. And this is, of course, this is one of the most discussed problems in the philosophy of language, I think, for the last certainly since Newman. And there are various suggestions for ways around this. What I want to suggest today is that this problem afflicts our characterization of substantivalism and relationalism in quite a deep and an important way, but there's a way that we can sidestep it in a manner that's neutral with respect to a particular solution to Putnam's paradox. Another way of saying that is, we cannot get substantivalism and relationalism off the ground unless we solve Putnam's paradox. But everything that I say about the setup is going to be neutral with respect to the manner in which we solve Putnam's paradox. Hopefully this will become a bit clearer as I go on. So here, let me invoke John Ehrman's characterization of substantivalism and relationalism. This is from World Enough in Spacetime. Again, this is just one component of a longer sort of conjunctive characterization. The reason I'm choosing this is because it's explicitly model theoretic. So for John Ehrman, for the substantivalist, the following claim holds. Bodies, which in my terminology we can just read as material spacetime points, or perhaps regions if you're unhappy about points. Material spacetime points may or may not appear in the domain of every intended model, but immaterial spacetime points do. Right, that's the claim that the substantivalist makes. This is the reason that I use the word immaterial rather than unoccupied, because an unoccupied spacetime point is an example of an immaterial spacetime point. But I think Ehrman is also thinking about something like a Hartree field view of field theories, on which you've got this underlying manifold, and your matter fields are just treated as properties of those underlying points. Well, those underlying points are still supposed to be part of the substantival space, and those are the sorts of things that I want to refer to as an immaterial space-time point. But anyway, we can say more about this. I'll say more about this if necessary. John Ehrman's relationalist, on the other hand, says material points, or can be paraphrased in my terminology as saying material points exhaust the domains of the intended models of nomically possible worlds. Right. What does this have to do with Putnam's argument? Well, here's one substantivalist commitment, right? If it's the case that every intended model contains some immaterial points and some intended models contain material points, it is the case that there exists at least one model that contains immaterial points and no material points, right? There's at least one model that satisfies that. Now we run the Putnam move. We permute the domain elements, right? The domain elements are just supposed to be the points that we're having this discussion about. The result of that permutation is you're going to end up with some isomorphic model, some model that's isomorphic to the intended model, that contains only material points and no immaterial points, right? We're just flipping the labels. But that's explicitly a relationalist model on Herman's characterization, right? And so we now have the problem that the characterization of substantivalism has included some relational models. It turns out we have a similar problem when we go the other way, but this way was a bit easier for sort of dialectical purposes. So you might think, okay, well, there's a perfectly straightforward way around this. Just solve Putnam's paradox, right? Figure out a way to say that a certain selection of the isomorphic models are intended and a certain other section are unintended, and just throw away the unintended ones. And sure, that'll work, but I don't want it to be the case that we have to sort of invoke such heavy duty philosophy in order to just set up what ought to be a quite intuitively easy to understand debate, namely the debate between the substantivalist and the relationalist. So what would be nice would be, in the absence of an obvious solution to Putnam's paradox, if we could have a characterization of the debate that was neutral with respect to solutions of Putnam's paradox. And well, I suggest that there is one. And this is my suggestion. Here's how we should think about substantivalism. It's a bit fiddly, but it gets the job done. On the subdomain of relative spatiotemporal relations, right? So in other words, on the things that are putative spacetime points, the extension of some predicate, let's just call the predicate I, for immaterial. The extension of I is non-empty in every model, and the extension of some different predicate is, let's call it M for material, but it doesn't matter, is non-empty in some models, right? Another way of putting this sort of a bit more picturesquely is the substantivalist is committed to the idea that there are two types of spacetime points, the material ones and the immaterial ones. Although, as I said, it doesn't matter what we call them. Contrast that with the relationalist, who's basically committed to the idea that there is just one type of spatiotemporal relatum, or one type of spacetime point. Again, we can call it M, we can call it I, it doesn't matter. But the advantage of this characterization is it's like the worries that come from permutation arguments aren't going to hit this, right? You can permute to your heart's content, and what you're still going to be in a position to distinguish between substantivalism and relationalism, right? So that's my debugging of austere realism when it comes to talking just about ontological commitments. I suggest that in light of this suggestion, we rephrase the ontological question as how many types of spatiotemporal relata are there across the normally possible models? And then instead of it being a yes/no question, it's a question of how many you're committed to. I suggest the substantivalist is committed to 2 and the relationalist is committed to 1. A small aside on this is that at this level of characterization, there's no difference between relationalism and what's sometimes known as supersubstantivalism. I don't think that's the end of the world. And if people want to fight me on that, I'm perfectly happy for that to happen in this relay. But that brings me to the end of the little bit on austere realism. I think austere realism is in a good position to deliver on its promises of ontological commitments when it comes to space-time metaphysics. And so I take substantivalism, and I take one core component of substantivalism and relationalism to be exhausted by that. And so another way, I was sort of toying with the idea of, instead of thinking of characterizing substantivalism and relationalism in terms of these satisfaction of these predicates, to just refer to this as something like space-time dualism and space-time monism. But I decided to land instead on the side of thinking, when you say substantivalism, you haven't given me all of the information that I'm looking for, right? There's no such thing as unqualified. One ought not to talk about unqualified substantivalism. When you talk about or relationalism, when you talk about substantivalism, you're just making that quantificational commitment, and then you qualify it further by telling me what your view is with respect to this explanatory component, which I'm going to come to now. Right. So if you recall, the dynamical versus geometrical debate was supposed to be a debate over what explains what, right? Does space-time structure explain dynamical symmetry structure, or vice versa? And I think a lot of ink has been spilled by many of us in this room over the question of how we ought to understand this word explain. I've sort of come to the conclusion that at its most abstract level, it kind of doesn't matter. I'm much happier to countenance the idea that there are multiple dynamical versus geometrical debates kind of indexed by different accounts of what explanation is. And what I want to present to you today is what I take to be a sort of plausible way of spelling out one version of this debate that makes available a particular metaphysical cocktail that some people might find appealing. So with that in mind, one can choose as inflationary or as deflationary a reading of explain as one might like. In the paper of James's that I mentioned a little bit earlier, he catalogs some of the options that have already been discussed in the literature, things like constructive explanations, structural explanations, unificatory explanations. My suggestion is, while all of these are completely plausible ways of making sense of dynamical versus geometrical, the one that I'm interested in today is closer to a Dasgupta style deflationary account of grounding. And I could feel people in the room shudder when I said the word grounding. What I want to do is kind of along, in sympathy with Shamik, I want to sort of reclaim this word grounding and make it sort of philosophically respectable in a wider circle. So that's basically what I'm going to be interested in this section. I want to talk a little bit about how we ought to make sense of explanation. But in order to do that, I first want to canvass what people have already said about how one ought to understand the importance of explanation in space-time physics, right? So we start off with this idea of constructive explanations. This sort of stems from this distinction that Einstein famously made in a popular article in the Times between constructive and principal theories, and this is something that plays quite an important role in Harvey's presentation of the dynamical view. And the idea behind a constructive explanation is it's just an explanation which seeks to provide an account of, well, let me start this again. It seeks to explain the goings-on that you're interested in terms of the physical goings-on that underlie those observations, right? In many ways, it's extremely close to Boyd's causal explanation, except that it sort of explicitly eschews this this terminology of causality. And so James, for example, in his paper suggests that if you read the dynamical approach as being committed to the claim that a constructive explanation is the one that ought to be provided, well, then the proponent of the geometrical approach is out of luck, because that's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that the proponent of the geometrical approach can't do anything, because they might be able to invoke, for example, a structural explanation, right? And this is something that goes back to Rob Clifton. The idea that if we've got certain structural features in the models that represent the worlds that we're talking about, and we can invoke certain inferences at the level of the models or at the level of the mathematical structure, then we can use that as a way of explaining certain facts in the physical worlds or in the possible worlds that are represented by these models. Just for the sake of completeness, I'm going to mention Friedman's unificatory explanation. This is something that he talks about quite a bit in his 1983 book, where he argues for substantivalism on the grounds that it provides a unificatory explanation of the things that we want to explain. And so, as I said, what I want to suggest is these are all different ways of making sense of dynamical versus geometrical, and I don't want to suggest that any one of them is better than the others, except to suggest that mine is better than the others, because I think grounding, at least for the purposes of the kinds of things that I want to talk about in the last 15 minutes of this talk, I think grounding carves at the appropriate explanatory joints, so to speak. I'm not generally a fan of reading out a massive chunk of text, but I think this is just so trenchant that it deserves to be read in its entirety. This is from Shamik's paper on grounding. When he's talking about, he sort of starts off with this lovely bit of autobiography. He's talking about what it was like for him to discover this literature. And he said, as time went on, I began to read papers on ground that I didn't really understand. The concept was being stretched and deformed in various ways, reified in various ways, that went far beyond what had initially attracted me to it. This new literature seemed to take ground to be some part of reality, some metaphysical analog of the Higgs boson that somehow held the world together. The job of the metaphysician on this new conception was to peer into reality and discern where these ground-ons were flowing. Of course, to see these ground-ons, one needed goggles provided by specialist departments. Oh, this is beautiful. Not since the days of, David Lewis accusing Armstrong of having mighty biceps has there been such a level of sort of raw, kind of vigorous, sort of argumentative spirit in a metaphysical paper, at least in my opinion. But I think Shamik is completely right. I think we ought to reclaim the word ground, right? For similar reasons to us needing to sensibly be able to talk about things like causation, right? We use the word cause all the time. It's an ordinary language word, right? It should not be treated as a sort of very, very specific philosophical term of art. And I think we use the word ground in English, in natural language, all the time. And I think a similar story needs to be told, a similar sort of deflationary view of how the concept of grounding can, in Dasgupta's words, limb issues of intellectual interest. I think we really ought to take Dasgupta's views on this somewhat seriously, or completely seriously. And so what Shamik suggests is grounding should be thought of as providing a specific kind of explanation that he calls constitutive explanation. So we talk a little bit about what this might mean. So because in sort of ordinary language can point to various different sorts of explanation, right? It answers various different sorts of why questions. So you might ask the question, why did India lose to South Africa in the first ODI yesterday? It's a cricket thing. And there are various sorts of explanations that you can have. You can have the causal explanation, which is because Virat Kohli is no longer captain and they've just gone completely flat. And now they don't know anything about how to win a one-dayer anymore. Or you could go sort of constitutive, right? You could say something like, oh, well, it's because they scored fewer runs than the opposition, right? And those are both legitimate explanations. And there's no sense in trying to sort of subsume one into the other. There's no sense in which one ought to think of, the constitutive explanation or the ground explanation as being, in some sense, deeper. It's different.
All right. Okay. I'll find it there. Right. And
hi, Simon. Simon, your
Sorry,
mic is on.
well, I can meet you somewhere first if you'd like.
Sorry. Okay. It's muted.
Sorry. My train of thought, that lovely train of thought that hopefully we were all riding on.
I think it's just different. That was less.
Thank you. Maybe it's just different. And so the claim that I want to endorse, Dasgupta's claim, is we should try to characterize constitutive explanation in a way that sort of allows us to identify it when we see it. But we don't necessarily need a reductive account of constitutive explanation in order to use it, any more than we might need a reductive account of causal explanation in order to be able to talk about causal explanations, right? If we did need a reductive account, we wouldn't be able to get anything off the ground. We'd never be able to talk about cause and effect. That seems like a bad thing. So let's try to sort of spell out a non-reductive analysis of constitutive explanation. As I said, all of this is much of what I'm invoking over here is stuff that's in Shamik's paper. And it's again useful to have as a contrast causal explanation, because I think that's something that we at least have a sort of intuitive grip on. So I take a causal explanation to be asking a question like, what events happened such that X resulted? For example, this may not exhaust all kinds of causal explanations, but this is certainly a kind of demand for a causal explanation, right? If we saw a question like that, we'd say, oh, well, this is a demand for a causal explanation. How might you think about a constitutive explanation? Well, I suggest, I'm not the only person to suggest this, I suggest the following. In virtue of what is it the case that X? And again, I think we can talk usefully about scientific realism, naturalism, various sorts of things, invoke causal criteria without having to give a reductive story about causation. I mean, Boyd does it, Armstrong does it. We sort of know it when we see it. And I want to suggest that we can do the same thing with constitutive explanation, right? I'm not going to hold my breath for a general theory of constitutive explanation or grounding. But what I do want to say is, to the extent that I can make sense of these in virtue of locutions in this deflationary way that Dasgupta suggests, I think constitutive explanation is the correct way to understand dynamical versus geometrical, right? Do dynamical symmetries constitutively explain space-time structure or vice versa? I take that to be quite a straightforwardly meaningful debate to have, and one that hopefully now you'll at least see why I believe is orthogonal to the ontological question or the ontological debate. I'm doing pretty well for time. Good. So now in the last 10 minutes or so, maybe even less, I'm gonna sort of zoom in a little bit. I'm gonna talk about a very specific kind of luxury realist position that I call dynamical substantivalism. There are a few case studies I can think of in favor of dynamical substantivalism, but I'm only going to talk about one of them. I'm going to talk about the easiest one, but I'm happy to discuss and indeed discover others in the Q&A session. So recall what I took the take-home message to be. There's some cocktail of metaphysical views which is such that it would benefit from having dynamical substantivalism as an option. Let me give you an example of how that might be the case using one of the oldest thought experiments in the philosophy of space and time. This is Newton's globes, which is in the scholium to the definitions of Newton's Principia. I'm going to present it in a slightly, using slightly more modern philosophical terminology and machinery. But the basic setup is, imagine I've got two globes connected by a light inextensible string in an otherwise matter-free possible world. I can now ask the question, are the worlds in which all of the relational facts about these two, about the distances, the spatial distances between these two spheres, are the worlds in which the string has different tensions to be thought of as nomologically possible according to a particular set of laws, or merely metaphysically possible, right? Slightly more sort of, a slightly more intuitive way of thinking about this is, if you're a substantivalist, then you're going to be in a position to be able to define something like angular velocity and therefore angular momentum. And then if your force law supervenes not only on the relational distance facts, but also on facts like angular velocity, then you can have the same laws corresponding to different string tensions, because different string tensions will correspond to the two globes rotating at different velocities with respect to your substantival space. And this is often taken as a good argument for why you should be a substantivalist, right? But of course, the strength of this as an argument for substantivalism depends on how strongly you want to hold on to the idea that these worlds with the different string tension ought to be nomically possible as opposed to merely metaphysically possible, right? So as I said, the traditional claim is substantivalism makes them nomically possible. Relationalism requires them to merely be metaphysically possible, right? There've got to be different laws in each of these different possible worlds corresponding to the different string tensions, because the relational worlds don't have enough in them to allow you to make sense of the quantity of angular momentum, and therefore to make sense of another thing on which forces in the string could supervene. So it seems like in this particular situation, if you're going to be a proponent of substantivalism, you're kind of tethered to the geometrical approach. And similarly, if you're a proponent of relationalism, you're tethered to, if you're a proponent of the dynamical approach, you're tethered to relationalism. But now, imagine if, for completely unrelated reasons, you had the following combination of metaphysical views. You're a nomic primitivist in the style of Tim Maudlin, right? You think that the laws that govern a particular possible world are just basic brute facts about the furniture of that possible world. But at the same time, you want to be committed to the idea that different string tensions correspond to nomically possible worlds as opposed to merely metaphysically possible worlds, right? Seems like these are two unrelated commitments that you might have. And it would be nice if, if we didn't have a metaphysical no-go theorem, as it were, that precluded us getting these two things. There's a way in which you can set up nomic primitivism so as to entail the dynamical view, right? The idea being, supposing I look at all of the spatiotemporal relations that obtain between the two spheres at different points in time, those facts are going to be determined purely by the laws, because the laws are just a brute fact about about that world. I mean, there are ways of making nomic primitivism entail the geometrical view as well. All I want to consider is the possibility that you could have a nomic primitivist view that entails the dynamical view in the way that I just described. So that takes care of the first commitment. But of course, the second commitment, right, the different string tensions correspond to nomically possible as opposed to merely metaphysically possible worlds. Those seem to entail substantivalism, right? And so now we have a standoff if it's the case that the dynamical view is supposed to entail relationalism, right? Because you can't have, we've sort of, by construction, made relationalism and substantivalism mutually exclusive. So it seems like if you're a person who is antecedently interested or sympathetic to these sorts of metaphysical views, then you either have to be a dynamical relationalist or a geometrical substantivalist. Except that you don't. Because you might want to argue the following. You might say, okay, the geometric relations that obtain between material points are grounded in primitive facts about the laws of the world, right? And you can also say that all of the worlds in which that we're interested in right now, sort of all of the worlds with different string tensions, they all have the same laws. They're all governed by Newton's laws. All we need to get that off the ground is a commitment to a kind of substantivalism that will allow for different angular velocities in different possible worlds. And we can do that by invoking a commitment to the austere realist view of substantivalism, right? Without saying anything about explanation, at least when it comes to the quantificational question, right? Because if we have these unoccupied space-time points, we can define velocities with angular velocities with respect to these unoccupied space-time points. Moreover, we can define different angular velocities in different possible worlds, all of which are measured with respect to those immaterial space-time points in different possible worlds. And this, I contend, is a perfectly coherent, perfectly sensible thing to say. And this is not available as a view without, well, maybe I got ahead of myself. This is not available as a view without accepting the orthogonality thesis. And I take luxury realism to entail a particularly attractive form of the orthogonality thesis. So that's one area I take dynamical substantivalism to provide you with an option that was previously unavailable. And that's basically all I wanted to say. So let me briefly summarize the talk. We started off with this idea that abductive realism entails a denial of the orthogonality thesis. I then modus tollens that. I said, look, I think the orthogonality thesis is correct. And the way that I'm going to argue for that is I'm going to argue for the plausibility of luxury realism. And then said, okay, well, if we're going to take luxury realism seriously, we ought to sort of examine the foundations on which it's built. There's an explanatory component and there's the austere realist component. Hopefully, I've debugged both of them sufficiently well to at least establish they're in moderately good philosophical standing. And then I ended with an example. I have a few more that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A session of dynamical substantivalism, providing you with a coherent and arguably somewhat attractive position. Which in other words, just means that I've hopefully established all of the take-home messages. And if you've got off the train at some point before this, that's fine. But if you stuck with me all the way to the end, thanks very much. Thank you.